What's up? This is Silas. I'm back again. This is part two of the recording today, but this is an ongoing conversation that I have with my friend Steven. Say hello.
Hello, everyone.
Yeah, so this is a conversation that we've been having on critical theory by filtering it through Cynical Theories, which is a book Steven read that is written by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, and then he read it and you can tell us more about what you thought to do with this whole series and how we're approaching this.
Sure. So for this section, I want to talk about the chapter called Social Justice in Action. Basically, what it is the culmination of everything we've been talking about for these last several videos, how this is panning out in the real world and how people are being affected by it. I would argue mostly in bad ways. So
yeah,
sure.
Sorry, we just recorded a part. What was the part we just recorded for this?
Social justice, thought, and scholarship.
Yeah, so now this is the second follow-up to that. Now this is now the practical part of it. And as you mentioned, the other ones we talked about queer theory, we talked about critical race theory, talked about intersectionality, gender studies. We did one on the definition of postmodernism. And that was very theoretical. We touched a bit on the actual practical nature of how these things are applied. Problems occur not because of what X is, because of how you define X. So when it comes to the actual definitions that people were mentioning in a lot of those other sections, we're like, okay, yeah, that's we understand what you're defining there. But then I think the problem goes into now how people are defining those concepts into how they actually show up in society and what needs to be done about them. And I think that's what we're talking about here at Social Justice in Action, right?
Yes.
Okay, so let's get into it.
Sure. So this is ultimately the culmination, again, as I say, of these studies, but also the main point of this book. People see all these crazy things happening. They're wondering why, where did all this come from? Now, I would argue that the average person out there is not going out and reading Judith Butler or Kimberly Crenshaw, but these ideas are sort of filtered down from the university out into the popular culture. And you have all these, I would say, zealots coming out of university sort of spreading these ideas into workplaces, into social circles just in general. And a few examples that come up, for example, are James Damore. He worked at Google. He was fired for that memo talking about how there are differences between men and women. Of course, stuff going on in Hollywood with all these, now the Oscars require certain woke criteria. You have to have certain criteria met to have an award. It was funny, even Bill Maher, I saw, actually did a skit making fun of it. And he was saying how a lot of movies have already fit the criteria anyway at this rate. Of course, various people being fired and deplatformed. And it happened a few years ago, but I was thinking of James Watson. He was one of the people who identified the double helix design of DNA along with Francis Crick, where he talked about differences in intelligence between the races. He got driven out of academia. He had to actually sell his Nobel Prize for money because he was just, completely... So that's just the culmination of how crazy this has become. And I would also challenge anyone listening, if it has done some good, please show me where and why.
Yeah, so this is part of the things that the practical nature. This is like things like cancel culture, right? Like people going out and having the actual effect of literally affecting people's ways to earn and make a living and maintain a living. And arguably, I would argue that some of these things have gone to the points where people have literally been killed based off of this. Yeah. Or people have literally disowned family members, leading to suicides and other negative situations based on this. So social justice is not just it's not just you and your personal beliefs or your personal gods, and it's something that has an actual practical effect on day-to-day life. Yeah.
So as I started saying, it started in universities, it's gone now into public schools. Now, unfortunately, you see things like 1619 Project, they're talking about teaching that in public schools. You see things like how to be anti-racist baby. There's even books for teach small children about trans people now. Some of this stuff, I would argue, is pretty scary and ultimately detrimental. Now, I discussed recently in a Facebook thread with a friend that I think kids should be taught to be tolerant, but I don't think kids should be taught all this gender stuff at such a young age so they become confused and then the parents go and have them gender swapped. I think this is very scary, very destructive. And as you touched on in a previous video, this is not, to be clear, a majority of people. I mean, the people who say, oh, my kid's unclear about their gender, it's probably a minority, but still those kids' lives do matter. And And it's important to understand where this came from and why people would say that. So one of the things that I think is kind of interesting is a number of years ago, people used to say, oh, these social justice warriors, they'll get out into the real world, they'll grow up, they'll grow out of this. Unfortunately, that hasn't been the case. People get out of universities and they want to spread the ideology everywhere. I think it's sort of that the fervor of the converted effect, like, oh, this has shaped my life, I want to spread this everywhere. And that's why these people are imposing all these rules in workplaces, or at least trying to. And this industry at this point is ultimately, it's $1 billion industry. There's diversity, equity, and inclusion. You see that in different workplaces, in schools, all that. There's biased response teams that exist in academia as a whole, not just certain classes. Now, you could argue that they don't directly influence policy, fine, but the thing is, they do. They say they're supposed to facilitate education and persuasion. So, of course, by their standards, what does that mean? Well, whatever aligns with their ideology. And then anything that constitutes bias can be anything that's remotely positive about Donald Trump. It can be, there was someone where there were phallic snow objects that someone criticized. Someone got in trouble for saying, I don't see color. That's the thing. So again, it goes back to the point in the previous video about people like Ibram Kendi. You give these people a blank slate to say, we decide what's problematic, it's going to be enforced. Well, they're never going to stop. It's just going to be whatever they disagree with. And that I think is very disconcerting. And of course, you've seen speakers being prevented from speaking, oftentimes because the cost of security is so high, the colleges just decide it's not worth paying it. This happens to Ben Shapiro, Milo Yiannopoulos when he was bigger. There's also been issues, too, of we always talk about the left sort of eating itself, and there are cases of that, too. For example, one scholar, Rebecca Tuval, got blasted because she compared transracialism to transgenderism. You sort of touched on that in a previous video. Basically, she made the argument of, well, if people can change their genders, why not their races, too? But she got blasted. It was told she's insensitive. They tried to fire her, all that. So I thought, in a way, I mean, not funny what happened to her, but it's funny because I feel like it could be kind of an innocent question of like, well, if I can identify as different genders, why can't I identify as different races? But of course, that was problematic. She got in trouble. Someone else here, let's see, his name was Bruce Gilley, or Gilley, Gilley, I'm not sure. He wrote something called The Case for Colonialism, arguing the benefits that colonialism had. So, of course, you can imagine how that went over. They tried to get him fired. He got death threats. They even called to have his doctorate revoked, all that. Now, he was writing it more as a mental exercise to sort of show, okay, these are the these are the things, these are the medical technologies that improve the health of certain indigenous people. These are the technology that improved lives in general, all that. He was writing that sort of as a mental exercise to sort of write against decolonization. But of course, this was considered problematic for reasons that are pretty obvious by now. So I just thought it was crazy because, again, this is a case of the left eating itself. Like, even people who initially subscribed to a lot of these ideas are getting attacked as well.
Yeah.
And I would argue this ultimately sort of undermines rigorous scholarship because people can't ask these tough questions like, was colonialism beneficial in some ways? Did the Europeans do good things along with all the atrocities? And I think if you prevent people from asking those questions, it prevents that rigorous scholarship and ultimately harms everybody. So I also thought of AOC's line about it's more important to be morally right than factually correct. Like, I feel like that's the attitude a lot of these people have.
with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, you can call me sexist, but she's a gorgeous human being. Like, she just looks, she's an attractive person, physically, the way she carries herself. I also really appreciate how honest she is. I am somebody who, I value truth. Truth and honesty are not necessarily the same thing, because somebody can be honest and tell me what they think is, they can be honestly telling me something that's completely false. Like, somebody could honestly tell me about, like, the Quran and what Allah wants for my life, and I think that's not true information, but they can be completely honest with it. But I really think she's a true believer in what she says and what she does. How she does it is something else. I really recorded this. I don't know. This is probably posted before this is posted. But there's it's like with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and a lot of the people in postmodernism, in social justice, in this field in general, are when you actually hear what they say in context, it sounds worse. Like, like in many cases, you hear something, you hear the context, like, okay, that makes more sense. But then, yeah, some of the things she says are just like, wow, that is not say that. But yeah.
So unfortunately, the STEM fields are starting to get infected with this as well. James Lindsay had a tweet, or well, I think it was a thread where he talked about now some people are trying to do STEAM, which is science, technology. What is it? Science, technology,
engineering, arts,
engineering, and yeah, arts and math. So they're trying to find ways to sort of slip in this stuff. Of course, you obviously.
And I'm an artist, and it's not in there. That's no. Don't add art to that. No, like I believe art is a language of life, but it's I think the first extra thing we did expression wise once we had the basics of life actually dealt with to a certain level that we had free time. Then that's when we had the room for art. And I think science, technology, engineering, and maths, those are things that deal with the objective, practical aspects of making life, navigating the world and dealing with nature itself in a more practical, effective way. Those are what's used for that. Art is a bonus. It's a very valuable bonus. I think it's the most human of bonuses, but it's a bonus. Don't put it in there. Please, just stop that.
Well, even Lindsay himself pointed out what they call the hard sciences versus soft sciences differ as well. I mean, physics and chemistry versus sociology and psychology. It's the soft sciences. It's not that they're not valid. It's that the testing, the rigor, it's not as developed. Whereas physics, we can calculate exactly, okay, this particle moves here at this speed and that affects this. Whereas a lot of these other things are still being figured out.
There's definitely nothing artistic about H2O, like dihydrogen oxide. Like there's nothing there's nothing artistic about that. It just is. Please, people, we don't have to be everywhere.
So, of course, this is the corruption of the universities, because universities are ideally supposed to be, I don't know if I want to say unbiased, but they're supposed to take a broader view of things, and there's supposed to be a lot more rigor and research, because one of the criticisms that think tanks and certain research centers employed by corporations get is that because they're being funded by certain companies, that there's that old expression, whoever pays the piper calls the tune. So that's one of the arguments that comes up, for example, in the climate debate, is that, well, some of these companies get money from, some of these think tanks get money from oil companies. So if that's the case, how are they? Of course, they're going to promote fossil fuels. Now, whatever your thoughts on the whole climate debate, we can argue it either way, but that argument makes sense. But again, universities are supposed to be about competing ideas. The whole point of tenure was that if some thinker discovers something new and it upsets the order of things, they can't be fired simply for that. That was the whole purpose. And it wasn't supposed to be, this is an intellectual priesthood where, quote unquote, our betters decide what's true and everyone just goes along with it. That was never the goal.
Yeah, and the same influence that we agree that if an oil company is funding this school, chances are that school will have pro-fossil fuel stuff. Yeah. In the inverse, if a government is putting out incentives and grants and special programs for people who have gender studies programs, chances are that university is going to find ways to include more gender studies academia. Like, it's just be consistent with some of these things.
We can discuss this more if we do those videos about Magnus's and Brennan's book, but like, they make the point that, look, people are people. Incentives are incentives. People abide by the same rules. Again, there are professors who spend more time researching rather than teaching because it's more lucrative. It gets the university prestige. It gets them prestige. It gets them promotions and more money and all that. So it's not that these are evil people. It's just they're acting in their own self-interest. And it's, okay, I can keep teaching. I can be the best teacher ever, but I won't get recognized. I write a few papers that reach higher places. The university is going to get all this attention. It's going to get money, all that. I'm going to get recognized. I'll get a book deal. So, of course, which are people going to choose? It's not rocket science. Yeah.
And that will be the next conversation series that we do get to, is talking about more specifically. What was the book in specific?
Cracks in the Ivory Tower, The Moral Mess of Higher Education by Phil Magnus and Jason Brennan.
Okay, well, that's the next book we're going to do, the similar discussion series that we have on this one. And you had mentioned the case of colonialism, and I was thinking about the things that taboo topics. People in the political right who say, oh, we can't have stem cell research because that's working with babies and lives. I'm like, no, we should have stem cell research. We could save many people's lives. But due to like mostly religious regions, they have that. And then now you have on this opposite side where people say, oh, we can't have the case for colonialism. That's a taboo topic. We can't talk about that because of their oppression narrative. This group is constantly oppressed. I'm like, no, we should be able to discuss something like that. And then it's say we shouldn't actually have a discussion on this. Is you look at a topic like a case for colonialism or something, thinking we're having this conversation in English. And then it's not just something where it's just a language. It's just equally the same as Luya, which is the language of my ancestors. Like, no, I don't have any reason to learn Luya right now. I might eventually later on in my life or use it in like our animation and stories. But think about there's something I've thought about this. It might be something that goes with the actual language itself that enabled certain ideas and things to come by, like the idea of talked about with liberty, libertarianism. Some of these things might not come in particular because you had a language that was able to even actually condense these terms. Because I think in Arabic there is no actual term for individual freedom in that sense. Like imagine not even having a term for that, let alone even thinking that if you can actually have a concept in a language to actually talk about something, that helps you be able to communicate and expand on it. So for me, that's one of the benefits of colonialism. It's English. It's the ability to communicate in different ways. But I'm not saying English could have only been learned through colonialism. There's places right now who are learning English without colonialism, but that is something that did happen earlier in certain places. And I think if you look at the places that speak more English than don't, in places that were colonized, there's a noticeable higher level of things that you can objectively say this society is XYZ. Just saying. But yeah, keep going. Sorry.
Well, I would also sort of add how if you go back to the ancient Greek, they talk about how a lot of those words don't easily translate into English either. Like, for example, Aristotle's eudaimonian ethics. Well, what is eudaimonia? It's roughly something like happiness through fulfillment achieved via your purpose. It's like it's hard to condense. It's hard to condense to one word or even a small sentence, but things like that. And then they say too how Polis in school were taught that it's a city-state, but then some have argued that it doesn't fit the exact definition because it could be a community, it could be more out in the country, but it's more like the body politic people in that area sort of working together to run things. So things like that where it's like they don't translate readily, but it's interesting to observe to show how these cultures developed accordingly.
And when something doesn't translate, it happens a lot in social justice where people try to like rubbish the meaning, the current accepted meanings of things. I do understand language does change over time. Something like saying like bitch when I was a kid, that was like, you couldn't even hear that on TV. I don't remember specifically which show, but I remember around the time when it was actually a news story that the first show that actually said bitch on TV that wasn't censored, I think it was like a CBS night show. Like they were talking about it weeks before it came, and then after they're like, oh, they finally said it. Now it's just like a regular thing. Yeah.
So, of course, we've seen the consequences of this other stuff, as you sort of touched on, all the rioting, milkshaking people. Now people say, oh, what's the big deal with a milkshake? Now that a person who throws a milkshake can actually be charged with battery because you can put a corrosive substance in there. I know you could put something heavy in there, all that. So that's why that's come under fire. Of course, there have been death threats, there have been stalking, harassment, all that. Some of these companies, I think, are in a very tough spot. For example, when George Floyd died and they all started posting BLM stuff, I think they're in that spot where they're basically between a rock and a hard place because they know people are going to criticize BLM and all that, but at the same time, they don't want to get attacked during riots or they don't want to get smeared by the media. So Amazon, dating websites, other things will put up something saying, we support Black lives, we stand for racial justice, and then it's sort of seen like, okay, we're on the right side of things, and then people won't come after them. So one thing I was talking to my grandfather about is he's wondering, does everyone really believe this? And I was saying, I don't know. It's like with the NFL and other things. I don't know that all those people are fervent BLM supporters. I think they want to appear on the right side of history, to use the Marxist expression. And then if anyone criticizes them, they can say, look, we're doing the right thing. And then they're protecting themselves.
Yeah, it's an economic decision. It's a cost-benefit analysis. Like, what do they really gain or lose by not saying something versus saying it? And then, because what's the actual effect? And as you'd mentioned before, what's the numbers? What is the percentage of the people that truly believe this versus the percentage that just signal it? The signal, I think, is a lot stronger than the actual percentage of the people believing. So just the same way how you look at the fundamentalists and say, oh, what Christian actually thinks that because the Bible said XYZ about homosexuality, but no man shall sleep with another man, that is enough to think homosexuals are going to hell and shouldn't be allowed to be married. The percentage of Christians that actually think that versus the few preachers that can get that message out or people can point to is different. I think most Christians, if they have an objection to that, wouldn't be based off of that. And you'd mentioned the 1619 Project. We have a separate conversation on that. Suggest you guys check that out. And also, James Damore thing, as you'd mentioned. This comes with the signaling. I would encourage companies to signal and to hire people based on these things, and then see. Let Google say we are hiring. We just want to have 50% women, 50% men in every part, and then have another company say we just want to have the best people. And then see who's actually going to. Like, I wish it was more than signaling. I wish these people who signaled actually acted on it and were a lot more open about it versus just having these human resources things in the back where they actually muck things up and change things around. Even though I think post-pandemic, now that there's not so much excess wealth and people have realized there's a lot more important things to worry about than some of these things, you're going to have less of this social signaling type of hiring type of things. Identity hiring is going to reduce, and they're going to go back to more to meritocratic hiring and actually getting the results of what needs to actually be done, I think.
Yes, I agree. So to sort of add on to your last point, according to a Hidden Tribes report, they said only about 8 to 10% of the population is left-wing activists, and big surprise, it's usually upper middle class, wealthy white people. And one statistic,
10 to what percent?
8 to 10%.
Okay.
And one thing I bring up a lot is how I think they said something like 78% of the population does not use Twitter. So you think about it, you're looking at 22% of the population on Twitter, and not all of those people are radical lefties either. I mean, obviously, I follow James Lindsay, Matt Walsh, Ben Shapiro, Cassandra Fairbanks. You can go on and on. So when you break it down, how many of the people on there are even out of that percentage are radical leftists, and how many are just moderate people, how many are just following? It's just there's a handful of people that are super loud, vocal, and active, so it seems like, oh, this is a powerful force when it's really not.
There's a bit of the Pareto principle there, because there again, it's also, I think it's said about 10% of the users on Twitter are responsible for about 80% of the actual tweets. So it's like, and how many are dead accounts? There's probably at least 10% people who just created accounts and haven't been back since they created them. Not even counting the people who just actually are dead and never actually shut down their account. Yeah.
Twitter is not real life, as they say.
Yes. It's part of real life, but it's not real life,
So the authors go on to cite 2 books, one of which I mentioned previously, The Coddling of the American Mind by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt. Very good book, I recommend. There was another one, too, I'm not as familiar with. It's called The Rise of Victimhood Culture, Microaggressions, Safe Spaces, and the New Culture Wars. It's written by Bradley Campbell and Jason Manning. So this explores things more from a sociological analysis. The other one's more psychological. So in the first one, they talked about cognitive behavioral therapy and how social justice scholarship has the reverse effect, where it makes people more paranoid, more distrustful, more angry, more anxiety-ridden, depressed, all that. This book, they talk more about culture and how it's shaped by certain values. So they talk about what's called dignity culture versus honor culture. So honor culture is more about sort of might makes right. It's more about strength, self-reliance, wrong acts go unpunished. Dignity culture is more about ignoring slights, but working out conflicts through legal means. And they've argued that the social justice stuff has kind of taken the worst of both of those, where on the one hand, there's sort of the sensitivity to slights, but there's also the idea of having authorities impose rules and enforce things to make sure that the rules aren't broken. So that's why people want safe spaces, microaggressions, all that, and this is why they go to people's employers and get them fired, because the idea of, oh, they're acting out, punish them. So it's sort of the worst of both, and on top of that, it rewards weakness rather than strength. I sort of channel Nietzsche here a bit with the slave morality idea of weakness, victimhood, all that. If that's glorified, well, you're going to get more of that because it's rewarded, essentially.
Yeah.
And let's see here. And of course, obviously, the valorization of victimhood and fixation on power struggles. And some people could also said, we touched on this in other discussions, but in many respects, this stuff is a victim of its own success, because if you think about it, like a lot of these major problems have been resolved, as we've said, like segregation has ended. There are laws, there are a lot of laws against discrimination. Women have access to the same universities and careers. But I think it's one of those, it's sort of that St. George and retirement syndrome thing of, no, it's not enough, we have to keep going. Where's the next dragon to slay? And this is why this stuff has just become so crazy.
Yeah. And that's what we were talking about before with the words thing, and I mean how words transition. It seems with some of these things, some of these concepts, I don't know. It might be hard to just invent new words. Why do certain groups seem to be more about taking away the definition of the words, and instead of inventing a new term, like for example, you talk about those Greek terms that mean several things, and then now it takes several English words to explain what was meant by one word. So maybe there's many different things that exist. Now, instead of saying, oh, wealth isn't this, oppression isn't what it has been, let's now change it. Why don't they find a way to create a different term, a different word, or a different group of terms that would define what they currently mean as oppression? That's something that's kind of frustrating to me.
So just a few more instances of what happened. There was the whole decolonizing Evergreen scenario. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, where basically they wanted to make the campus safe for black kids and they had to find racism on campus. So Brett Weinstein, he was a professor, he's no longer there, basically said, well, where's the evidence of racism on this campus? I guess people actually came after him with baseball bats and all this other stuff. And it was really crazy because the thing is, Weinstein's pretty left-leaning. I mean, I think he was even a Bernie Sanders supporter. So you think about it, he should be on their side. But because he didn't subscribe to all of this, they came after him. And I don't think he got fired. I think he left on his own, but it wasn't under great terms. But they've said that whole instance actually hurt the college a lot. Like their enrollment is a small fraction of what it should be, because people say, no, this is crazy, and you're just sending kids here to be indoctrinated. Not going to have a part of that.
There's an excellent documentary by Mike Nina. I think it's Nayana, where he talks about Brett Weinstein, Heather Hang, and just talk about the Evergreen thing. And you might have heard about that in passing, but I think for many people, that was one of the first times people really saw this come on the stage. And this goes back to what we were talking about, is the numbers versus the signal. Now, you've seen different effects of it in different colleges, but you look at the actual numbers, and I think they go close to that 8 to 10% that you're talking about when you look at actual other colleges and say, how active is it in the University of Georgia, for example? And it's probably not that active. If you actually talk to the actual students, they might only be about 5% that actually say they're social justice warriors or that kind of sense and identify these things. But they will be very active within that university. And I think the teachers might be 25% or so like that. But you get to that point. But with Evergreen, it was a specific school for that. I really suggest you check this out to see that. And I think when you see this, you'll also get a bit more heartened, like I have, where I'm like, I can't imagine what happened at Evergreen happening en masse all around the country. Like there's a point when people find out about these things, it's going to be like, that is not the way we're going to do things. There was already many issues with Evergreen. It was specifically an experimental college type of environment to try different ways of where kids could decide when they come to class how they learn in different places. And you can see that, and that's what it was. And that attracted somebody like Brett Weinstein and his wife, Heather Hang, because that's what they were attracted to. They wanted to break down some of these structures. They wanted to find new ways of learning, new ways of interacting with people. And when you do that, you're going to find worse ways, you're going to find better ways. And this is by any argument of it, was a worse way.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And as I've sort of been saying too, I think a lot of these ideas can only really exist in an echo chamber, like Robin DiAngelo and Ibram Kenny's work. Again, all this stuff, they want to end racism, that sounds great, but then you think about what they're advocating, what the ramifications would be, how it applies in the business world. A lot of this stuff doesn't make sense. And it's funny because Robin DiAngelo even says, my book is for white progressives. Notice she says that. She doesn't say that this is for everyone. So I'm sensing a lot of confirmation bias. This is people who just want to feel morally superior in that they're fighting racism. That's been my experience.
Yeah. And it's a weird part about it.
And I think, too, one thing that really has to be pointed out here, and where I sort of get annoyed with, I guess, the boomer generation, is where that they let these crybabies have all this power and say. Because look, we all go through a phase in our early to mid 20s where we think we know a lot more than we do. Like I've definitely been there. Maybe you have too, where it's like you learn a few things, you think you have all the answers. I saw this at culinary school too. People learn how to cook a few things, they think they're going to be star chefs, and then they look into, okay, what is the industry actually like? How hard is it to climb? And people ultimately get sort of humbled and they realize, hey, look, I don't know as much as I thought I did. I don't have all the answers, all that. So I don't see why empowering people in their early to mid 20s is a great idea, because they still haven't figured a lot out. And maybe some of these people will calm down or hit breaking point and snap, but at some point they'll look back and say, what was I thinking? But if we realize that's how things are, I don't see the reason for empowering younger people in such a way.
Yeah, it's different. I mean, we were a lot younger of a person, and also when you had a lot more limited things in your life. If you were growing up in a village, by the time you've seen 8 years in that village, the things get kind of repetitive. By the time you get into your teens, you know pretty much everything there is to know about that village. So in that context, you can be an adult in that kind of place. The amount of information, amount of possible things you might have to deal with, where there's a difference between sex, gender, and then like the experience. We've talked about this in a different video, in several different videos, where you can be male, then you can be a man, a boy or a man, and then you can be masculine. So by the time you're 10, you know pretty much many of the things that what a man, somebody who's male-bodied, would need to do to change from a boy to a man in that culture and behave in a masculine way. But now, when you live in the West, we have so many opportunities, so much access to different things, different ways of doing things, that I think comparatively, the amount of information you need to take in to actually make a decision on how to properly fit into the society or most effectively fit into a society takes a lot longer in the Western world today, if you listen to this, compared to what it did 100 years ago living anywhere. So I think that's something to keep into time. So the 20-year-old, I think the founding fathers were in their 20s, right? Most of them were.
Yeah.
So it's not the same. Would you imagine the founding fathers they wrote the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, all those things. What do you think a group of 20-year-olds would do if they were actually inventing a country today? Would you want to live in that country? I would not. If you just think like a group of 25-year-olds from like New York City and like start a country, I would not want to live in that country. But the United States of America is still here. So yeah.
So again, I just ask people, depending on their age, it's like, look, if you're 20-something and you think you know everything, yeah, it's a passing phase. You'll get into the real world, you'll realize it's not the case. If you're older and you're somehow deferring to these people, I would ask why, because again, what do they know that you don't know, or what do they know you're not capable of learning? As I said in, I think, the first video, every younger generation thinks they know way better than the people that came before. And they fail to appreciate that, no, there was a wisdom in the older ways, there was an insight. Now, I'm not making the reverse argument of let's appeal to tradition and just go by what older people say. No. But at the same time, don't just look at older people as sticks in the mud and that they're outdated. No, they know they've gotten some things right.
I think you can argue. I would argue on the side of more, but more is not equivalent to better. Just having more of something, more quantity of information, does not mean it's more. It's better information. But before you say bye to the stuff that older generations know, at least know enough about them to know why you shouldn't still consider that to be something worth knowing. That makes some sense. Yeah, I think it does.
Well, and this also, this stuff is spread out into general other communities as well. And it's interesting is that some of the left-leaning people, like Carolyn Borisenko, who I brought up, she actually said that she was in a knitting group and that got infected with social justice ideology. And she was like, guys, I just want to do my knitting. Why are we talking about this? And then Atheism Plus, as you remember, James Lindsay talked about being disillusioned with that. And then also my own mother was talking about, she had this like Hudson Valley local or something group where they like post pictures of the Hudson Valley, comment on scenery, and people will be like, oh, did you hear what Trump said in it? It's like, come on, really? It's like, I just want to enjoy the scenery and local stuff. And it's ruined a lot of things because like I keep criticizing with sports and movies and stuff, people go to those things to escape politics. They go to those things to escape reality. They don't want to lecture on how and why they're racist in these ways and they have to change.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with having spaces where you want certain information to not be there. Now, I'll question about the people who say we want black-only spaces, basing these decisions based off of things that people had no control of. We want female-only spaces. I guess you can make some arguments for these things, but then don't be upset when the inverse, when people say we want white-only spaces, we want male-only spaces. But that whole idea of saying we want spaces that are free from certain ideas, I'm not against that as a general concept, but just make it universal, make it be something that you might have ideas that are not going to be allowed in certain places, a certain behavior. You might physically be a certain being that may not be allowed in a certain place. And you also, as a certain being, have the right and the expectation to say, I can choose and decide what other ideas I want to be exposed to, what other beings I want to spend my time with. Accept that. My objection to slavery isn't people deciding who to deal with. It's that person you decided you want to work for you, not being allowed to say, I don't want to work for you. That's the part I object to, not the part of somebody saying, I am different from this person. This person is, I'll say it is worth different. I personally feel I'm personally more worth than Stephen because I myself, and I consider Stephen to be personally more worthwhile to me than 99.9999999% of the world because he's a good friend of mine. So that's something like I would object to somebody saying, I have to have this conversation with a random person. I would prefer to have it with Stephen and record it and post it and have you guys and gals and gents and females and whatnot listen to it. Okay. So yeah.
So just to sort of wrap up here, so I would say sort of like the Marxism that spawned it, a lot of these ideologies look good on paper, but if you look at what's in them, it's not the case. Lindsay likes to make the analogy of like you have this beautiful present, but then there's a complete mess inside. I've sort of made the analogy of it's that old expression, don't judge a book by its cover. Yeah, a book can have a beautiful cover, but what's inside? That's why you're reading the book, and it's the same thing with this. Yeah, you can tell me you want to end racism, you want to fix inequality, all that, but what do you want in practice, and what is it going to take to do that? And that goes to my earlier point about totalitarianism and how, like with Marxism itself, and what worries me a bit with this stuff is when things don't pan out as they want, they become increasingly violent and repressive, and they start making excuses for why things don't pan out accordingly, and then they, again, become more violent and repressive to try and bring them about. And you get cases like the Soviet Union where people can't construct working timepieces, crops don't grow, there's shortages of some things, excesses of other things, but they're not willing to dig down into the core principles and say, no, this is flawed. Ludwig von Mises' economic calculation proves socialism doesn't work. No, they're still wedded to that idea that they're willing to go to any means to achieve the ends. And I think that's very scary, whatever your ideology is or whatever your goal is.
Yeah. And when you throw that whole idea that, oh, we're all worth the same, price calculation is impossible. Yeah. You have to be able to calculate what you do with yourself and your time. That is the basics. That's the basis of living. It's just interacting with people. Things have different value at different times, and we live in a certain order of things. So you're going to have a what's the time? I keep forgetting the actual thing. The deference of what's
time preference.
Time preference, yes. That I keep forgetting. Yeah, that time preference. Yeah. That is something that is why the world is the way it is today. By having that ability to actually.
And again, I sort of made this point in the last conversation, but they say philosophy, who needs it? Well, economics, who needs it? Well, everyone. I mean, you're buying something, you're doing economics. You're deciding what to do with your life, economics. You're saving money. These are unavoidable facts of life. Even now, if you don't want to get into a scholarly discussion, okay, that's fine. But these are realities that everyone deals with. There's no escaping that. Even if you want to go to the very basic level that Rothbard and others start with, if you're on a desert island figuring out how am I going to gather food, how am I going to survive, that's economics. Economics originally was household management, so you can't escape that reality. Yeah.
I mean, it was originally household management that was mostly done. I guess he was partially, but the females had had a big hand at the mothers of the homes and things like that. And that's why I don't think. You see right now the different things in general, and that's more, I think, the schooling system. That's why I'm looking forward to this next. That's part of why I'm looking forward to this next conversation series we're going to go in with the actual information, because this whole idea that women are not able to do these things, it's just the context. I think they'd be able to understand it in different contexts from different interests, because they were interested in their own home. And I think you can see that with the different sort of voting patterns that happen once a woman is married with children. And she has that very real interest and understanding of my physical home needs this sort of economics. they kind of change their approach to the world and other issues. It's not the social justice in general for all these random, supposedly random people out there versus what is best for my children. And that kind of brings in a different perspective on some of this.
Well, I have this friend, she's like a moderate lefty, and she's funny because she used to be a feminist, and then she got married and had a kid, and she like completely calmed down, and she even said like modern feminists are annoying and all that. And then I remember there was this woman that she used to work with, and I showed her some of the stuff she posted, and she's like, yeah, this is why I don't identify as a feminist. But again, that experience of, well, you got married and now you have a baby boy, so it's going to change your perspective on you can rail against patriarchy, okay, but you have to raise a boy, then how is he going to be in the world? How is he going to be influenced? What problems are he going to deal with? And I think, I can't speak for her, obviously, but I think that perspective changed her a lot.
Yeah. I mean, society was created to be a better vehicle or to create better environments in order to reproduce.
Yeah.
And I think you have an increasing amount of people who have access to sharing their thoughts and influence in how societies ran that don't really care that much about reproduction. Yeah. And I think just having that makes you give it your different perspective on some aspects of society. And you see a lot of actual major, powerful world leaders don't have kids. And I think you can also see something that goes into that. And it's kind of interesting to think about.
So I would say here the postmodernists were right in the sense that we can't rely on meta-narratives, but again, their problem is that they try to label reason and science meta-narratives, which they're not. They're systems that are self-reflective and allow for correction by their very design. And I think you said this in the first discussion. The issues too is that they take for granted all the progress we have, and they act like things are so terrible. Like I say, post-colonial studies, they cite things from 100, 150 years ago, and yeah, I'm not going to defend it, but it's like, what does that have to do with today? The fact that that stuff is considered a travesty today, that's proof of how much we've progressed. And again, maybe in the future they'll look back, I'm sure they will, they'll look back on things we did now and say, what were they thinking? But that's how progress happens. Everyone is doing, I think most people are doing what they consider the best that they know during their time period, but then that's how and why knowledge progresses. Then we can look back and say, okay, we were wrong on that, but now we know better. But you can't take for granted all these improvements, and you can't lose sight of how and why things got better. That's one of my issues with these people.
Yeah, and that might be part of the major issue that you see with social justice. Is part of it is based on a dogma or on the ideology, on reasoning that does say that there actually is no meta-narrative, that states that there are no objectives. But in social justice, as we discussed, is something that actually tries to actually get into getting objective results, objective goals, having things done. Let's round up this group of people in order to address this issue and achieve this result. But that is a meta-narrative. That is saying there is to be actually dealt with. Yet, like their basis on this is there is no is besides the whole like maybe oppression. That would be something. Yeah. So that I think is one of the major difficulties that you see in social justice. And whenever you try to hold it consistently, it's quickly going to just crumble.
Yeah. So that's all I have for this section. Pretty short, like I say. Any concluding thoughts or ideas or anything?
No, that's it. I think if you've enjoyed this one, you should definitely listen to the one, if you haven't listened already, the one we listened to before where we expanded more. It was kind of a preamble to this one. And I think that might be part of why I've been rather short on my little tangents, because I got a lot of them out in the previous part. But yeah, so this is the practicalities with social justice. When did you first hear about social justice for anybody out there? Have you considered yourself a social justice warrior? As Stephen asked, you said if there's anything that's been positive or effective from something that you think is specifically social justice and is only social justice and can't actually be achieved in other ways. Like I mentioned before, English, there's other ways to learn English besides colonizing a place. So some of the things that you think have been attributed to social justice, there could be other effective ways to achieve the same things or better. But I just want people to kind of let me know if you think, make a case, sell me onto why social justice in what we've discussed in this video and the previous part is something people should follow. People who want a more just society should consider themselves social justice warriors in the way that is practically being carried out in general society at this time.
And I touch on this in previous discussions too, but how much of this is due to liberalism in the classical sense versus how much of this is due to social justice. It was like I made the point with government programs where certain problems are declining, they come in, they decline further, they say, oh, look, we did this. But then if you look at the years preceding, no, those things were in decline already. So I would argue the civil rights movement of the 60s, great, all that. The second wave feminism, it had its problems, but at the same time, oh, yes, women should go to the same colleges and have the same careers. But again, is that because of postmodernism? Is that because of intersectionality? Or was that happening before? And then they just sort of stepped in later and said, no, we're going to fix every inequality we can find.
Okay, yeah, good stuff, good stuff. It's been important stuff to know. And now we're going to end this. So Stephen has another recording to do, and let me not monopolize his time. Who are you recording with now? He's been.
I'm going to be on the Death to Tyrants podcast. The man's name is Buck Johnson. He actually read one of my pieces years ago and didn't realize we were friends on Facebook. So he's like, "Hey, why don't you come on my show and we'll talk about this?"
Good stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely check that out. I think that would definitely be out probably before this one. You have a couple of different parts to post of this video on this series. So thank you to Stephen. Thank you all out there for coming along with us in this conversation. We're going to come back with. It's one more part right now.
Just one more part. It's going to be the finale, some of our prescriptions, and just I wanted to get more into my general ideas as far as epistemology, values, and what are some alternatives to this that I think will be better at solving some of the problems.
So I look forward to that. I hope you guys out there are looking forward to that, guys and gals, and whatever's in the middle. Yeah. Goodbye.
Sure. Bye-bye.
All right. Good stuff.
Well, yeah. Yeah, I wanted to do the last section on its own because I think that would probably be at least 2 hours. It'd be more comprehensive. But I think, like you saw, these were short enough that we could kind of